very generous introduction. It's a treat to be here. I thought I would have this large wave that could kill all of us any minute. Right up there would, keep suspense in the room for a while, but just kidding. So I don't know really where to start. We've covered a lot of things here. So I'll, and my ex-wife once accused me of outlining, so I want to review one thing that gives us proper context. We always talk about the financial meltdown that affected journalists, but we don't really go deep on it, at least most journalists don't. And I'm mentioning it for a reason. It'll hopefully become apparent why I'm saying it. In the United States, so I'm only I'm not even an expert there, but readership, subscriber readership, news penetration in the U.S. as measured by purchasing subscriptions. The high point for the number of newspapers in the United States, 1916. The high point for the actual numbers of readers in America for print newspapers, they're also known as newspapers, the early 1950s, I think 1952. And for the last half century, I'm starting with the worst news possible to try to come back from the abyss here. But the last half century, and I learned this on a fellowship at Harvard from Robert Picard. I don't know if any of you know Robert Picard, but he has taught on 3 or 4 continents, ran the Media Institute in Sweden for all of the European countries, or many of them, 28 of them, and has taught in China and other places. He's written 25 books. The guy, I call him Yoda. He knows more about media economics and media journalism than any other human, as far as I can tell. And he pointed out, but other studies have confirmed that commercial media, I guess you'd call it eyeballs, and I'm mostly referring to print products as opposed to television, although it's also true with television in the U.S., has gone down consistently for, hold on to your seat, the last half century. That's not unique to the U.S. It's also true in Canada. Guess what? It's also true in Europe, in Western and Northern Europe. And the highest newspaper penetration on planet Earth, does anyone know where that is? Also the oldest population on planet Earth, not counting the penguins. Would you say? Japan.
I thought it was Finland too, had the highest.
No, Japan, yeah. And even Japan, where I visited a few years ago and talked to lots of journalists there at the press club, actually. Basically, even they, the oldest population on Earth and the highest penetration of newspaper subscriptions on planet Earth, they too are noticing all these young people with cell phones and other ways of accessing information. So the reason I mention all that is not to depress us. I mean, theoretically, we all kind of sort of knew this. The reason I mention it is I'm always a little bit amused when my friends in the media, in journalism, and yes, commercial media, will point out that, they'll look down their nose, for years they did, in nonprofit journalism and about the model, and they actually would never acknowledge those facts I just mentioned. And then I would say, they go, you can't do that kind of journalism. And my God, what's that about? They would go on with all this sort of skepticism. And I'd say, well, what's your model? This is like 10 or 20 years ago. And they'd say, well, we have advertising. And I go, oh. And I won't go there, but use your imagination there. That it wasn't really a terrific answer, it turns out. So I've always thought the nonprofit journalism bar was unfairly high and how it was being assessed by the condescending commercial media. I apologize for telling you this, but there's no way to... I'm an odd cat, if you haven't already figured that one out. It was a little unusual, I would say slightly strange, in fact, to break a 4-year contract and walk out the door from 60 Minutes. I quit one day. I got really mad because my story was censored. Not the whole story, just someone's name taken out. And it wasn't the first time. And so I broke a 4-year contract. I had a wife and an 8-year-old daughter and a mortgage on a house I was trying to pay. And by the way, did I mention no savings? And I said, I'm out of here. And I literally sent a 2-sentence resignation letter by fax. Back in the late 20th century, people use these things, called faxes. Anyway, I was in another city. I worked out of Washington. New York is where 60 Minutes is. And so anyway, this is akin to going on a swimming pool and diving in without looking to see if there's water. I just did it because the network movie, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I didn't know what I was going to do at all, zero. And I had offers to do all kinds of things. Yes, the other TV shows and stuff, but they were really bad shows. I won't mention names. Well, I could, but that's all right. But, and I was suspect to the print people because I'd worked in television. So, oh, you went over to the dark side. So, you know, and I thought, well, geez, so I like investigating the bastards. I just need to find a place. And I don't want anybody else telling me who I can report on. And one thing led to another, and I thought, well, hell with this. I'm just going to create something. And bear in mind, I had never run anything in my life. I had never managed money in my life. I'd never hired and fired people in my life. Other than that, it was a really good idea. So I got 2 friends who didn't know each other. That was on purpose because I didn't want anybody telling me what to do, and I had to also be in control of the board. Do I sound completely nuts? Yes, I do. The waves come. Yes. And, but that's how it worked. They were both journalists, and they were both talented journalists. One, a few years later, became the #3 official at NBC News in the U.S. The other one is one of the leading investigative reporters in the U.S. He's written a number of books translated into 12 languages. So these are both accomplished folks. They just happen to not know each other, and they were on both coasts. But so that was the beginning. The first meeting of the Center for Public Integrity Board was in the outfield of a baseball game, in between hot dogs, and it's a little bit of an idiosyncratic, unusual organization. I think it's fair to say. And we started from scratch. The first nonprofit newsroom in the U.S. to do investigative reporting was the Center for Investigative Reporting, begun by 4 unemployed journalists in California, similarly unemployed. In their case, they were outright fired when Jan Wenner, the creator of Rolling Stone, decided to move the office to New York. He didn't move the staff. And so they started out at Lowell Bergman's house. And so I was aware of that model. So there was a model to do that, but I didn't like the way it was run. Run is putting it a euphemism. It wasn't really run very much. It was more like a hippy-dippy commune. Sorry, that is being recorded, isn't it? Hello. And I mean, it was sort of a freelancer haven where they would get some core money to pay the rent and help journalists, but it wasn't intended. There was no interest in making it into something larger, at least initially. It was basically to pay bills and help land freelance gigs and kind of hold that glue together, help with research, things like that. It had the goals that understandably were modest at the outset. Obviously, I should finish that loop. Today, Center for Investigative Reporting is, at this moment, probably the largest nonprofit investigative reporting newsroom in the U.S. It's something in the approximating a 70 people budget in the range of, well, it has been in the range of 12 million. It may have slipped down a bit, but so to be fair, that was the first one. The Center for Public Integrity that I started was in 1989. That's the second one in the U.S. And just to round that out, the next one in the world, not just U.S., and first one that I'm aware of outside the U.S., and I haven't been to Antarctica and talked to the penguins or several other countries, but I believe the next one was the Philippines. Sheila Cornell and 8 other women decided to create the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. And yes, years later, as you heard, their reporting brought down the president of the Philippines, Joseph Estrada, a civil servant who had somehow managed to build and give to 5 of his mistresses, each a mansion, each one a mansion, and using land records and offshore banking info and other things, they were able to track who gave it, and he was impeached and removed from office. There were death threats against Sheila, as you heard, and she had to flee, but that group is still there. That was the 3rd nonprofit. And exactly what the next one was is a little murky. If you're interested in this, I did write a 17,000-word article. Seriously, I'm not kidding. I looked at the growing importance of nonprofit journalism and wrote a thing in 07. It was published in 07 by Harvard Shorenstein Center. The other one I profiled was the Romanian Center, started by 36 freelance writers from somebody's apartment. And one of the co-founders I'm going to see in Berlin on Friday, who's Stefan Candia. So, so that's the peculiar beginning to this, what some have called a movement or something. Today in the U.S. there are 100 nonprofits. I can go into detail about that in a bit. Well, I guess I will now since I mentioned it. The Investigative News Network was the original idea of the name, and just changed its name a few months ago to the Institute for Nonprofit News, but it's the same group of people. I put URLs over here instead of doing show and tell with the web, but you can write them down if you want, inn.org if you want to look at the member organizations. But, you know, like you might imagine, there's about 8 or 10 that are well run, well funded, or at least reasonably well funded, doing great things. Yes, of course, Texas Tribune is one of those 10 of the 100. You know, it's the Center for Public Integrity, the Center for Investigative Reporting, ProPublica, obviously, which was only created in 08. It was a relative newbie. I have teased Paul about this. ProPublica, not ProPublica, sorry. Yeah, ProPublica had the added advantage. I know it's a baseball reference, so I apologize. But, you know, there's 4 bases. A home run is 4 bases. ProPublica was born on 3rd base because a donor gave them $30 million. And, you know, that's a good way to start. I'm not familiar with that way, obviously. But, you know, they've done great work, and they won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and great stuff. But anyway, so those are some of the leading ones. There's another group that never gets counted. I've also tried to measure how do you count these, what do you call nonprofit, how do you define it. I mean, NPR obviously is a nonprofit, but I've always been unclear about the government part of this. What I'm referring to are entirely nonprofit and also non-government supported. I actually wanted to clarify, I always thought NPR got money partially from Congress, but are you saying it's the stations, not NPR itself?
The CPB grant goes to the stations.
Okay, that's what I thought. So then NPR can say we don't take government money, and the stations that run NPR do. I'm just trying to distinguish because it's always been a little because I know Congress lobbies NPR when they're pissed off, upset with a story, and so I was trying to figure it out.
That's helpful. We do lobbying on behalf of the stations.
Right. Okay. I got you. All right. Seriously, thank you for that. I was a little unclear. So the nonprofit phenomenon, as I mentioned, is a relatively new one. It's in the last quarter century, roughly, in the U.S. I mean, I don't want to turn it into a history lesson, but the history of the U.S. journalism world goes all the way back to the late 1800s in the progressive era, and there were idiosyncratic folks who were really not so much journalists as cause types. Even back to the Civil War, Frederick Douglass had a newspaper. The folks that did women's suffrage, Elizabeth Stanton and others, Susan B. Anthony, they had a newspaper for their issue. Ralph Nader was a muckraker before he started Public Citizen in the U.S. in the 60s. That's not the typical model, and none of them, they all didn't make a profit. They were for profit, but they made no money. But there has been a history of aggressive, shall we call it slightly unusual, nonlinear, from the heart, less than the pocketbook type models of frisky, shall we say, aggressive, idealistic journalism. Almost all of those so-called for-profits that made no profit were short-lived, shall we say. But I should note, when I say nonprofit, I mean it's a 501c3, IRS distinction. It is tax exempt, doesn't make a profit, no one takes a profit, and that when the founder leaves, no ownership does not, no one takes anything when they leave either. I mean, that's what nonprofit in the US means, which is relevant since I was the founder and I left after 15 years. And, no, I'm just kidding, I did the right thing. But anyway, so I just to tell you a little bit in two sentences about the center, you would expect I might do it. 15 years will do that. We ended up doing 300 investigative reports. 14 of those were books. We had a best-selling book, The Buying of the President, 2004, which was exciting. We had documentaries, Frontline and others that did things about our work. 10,000 news articles from our findings that made news all over the United States. And when, at the end of my time there, we had won 35 National Journalism Awards. The center has now won over 80 journalism awards, including the Pulitzer Prize last year. We had 250 paid interns inside the offices. The staff, when I left at the end of '04, at some point the founder really should leave the building. It's not healthy. People make jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid and stuff like that. It's just not, you got to get out of there if you want it to actually develop as an institution, not as somebody's, you know, dream or whatever. But anyway, it has become more institutionalized. When I had a board, it was almost all reporters because I didn't trust anybody. Because I sound very strange, don't I? But for good reason, though. But anyway, now the board of the center is almost all non-journalists, which it went from a founders board to what is known as a governing board, where the board should be bringing in resources and perspectives and points of view and contacts that the staff doesn't have already, and also more mature governance becomes more of a governing board, less of a founders board. And that's sort of what the center has become. ProPublica, by way of example, we talked earlier about Texas Tribune. ProPublica and Texas Tribune both had the good fortune of having a wealthy person, or in the case of the Sanders, two people, who had an initial idea and basically were willing to substantially support it at the outset. I believe the difference, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe that Herb Sandler is still the chair of the board. I know that, yeah, so the reason that's relevant is the staff reports to the donor. That's a little bit unusual in the U.S. Of all the nonprofits, it's the only case in 100. We would not allow a millionaire to serve on the board for the first 10 years, and we had a fierce debate for literally an hour or two, like, should we let a millionaire on? I mean, what's that going to do to our, you know, this is a club here, we're having fun. No. So it is a different mentality, but when, you know, seriously, if you're staked and fronted at the outset with $30 million, that really helps. Now, that's a burden. There's a group called the Global Mail. Has anyone heard of the Global Mail in the world? In Australia. And I was in Australia in 2013. And they asked me to speak to the staff. It was a nonprofit with about 10 or 15 people. I'm meeting with them, sort of similar to this. And they said, do you have any advice for us? And they had gotten money from a billionaire, an Australian billionaire, like 2 or 3 million. And I said, well, yeah, my biggest concern is you better start finding other donors, because donors are generally fickle. And it's very possible you're going to have difficulty because other donors will think you don't need their money because they read that this guy gave all this money. And I said also, these people are very fickle. These billionaires, they'll do whatever the hell they want. Be careful. Seriously, I actually said that. I get back to Washington, and about 2 or 3 months later, the guy pulled out his money, and the group collapsed. Mm-hmm. It's actually a really, really sad story because they were doing nice work. I was impressed, and they scattered to the winds. The group went out. So it can be a curse to be born on third base. If you don't, what they have done to their credit is to take that initial money and then get off of that money eventually. They're still getting a lot of money, but obviously, but they have reduced their dependency on just one donor, and that's no small achievement. I do take my hat off to Paul for that. It's not a problem I've ever had, but, he did the right thing there. The part of the center I do want to discuss very briefly is that I actually have to admit to you, I've started 5 nonprofits. The thing I'm most proud of is I'm going to show you if it's still there. I'm not sure. Oh, we're right there. No? Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Other side.
Oh yeah, you're right. This guy. Yeah. So back in. This is the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. In 1992, I went to my first international journalism conference. It happened to be in Moscow within 1 year of the attempted coup on Yeltsin. I wasn't a complete idiot, but I had never actually done a journalism conference outside the U.S. So I was pretty excited, and there was only a group of us. I would say 25 of us. Keynote speaker was Carl Bernstein, who used to be my boss at ABC News. He was the bureau chief when I worked there. And they had a brilliant journalist, Sir Anthony Sampson, who'd done Seven Sisters book in London, and Philip Knightley, and I mean all these brilliant journalists who had sources murdered in the streets in South Africa, journalists in Colombia whose sister was murdered, blown up, journalists jailed for the Official Secrets Act in India and Britain. And then the U.S. journalists complained about their Freedom of Information Act taking too long. But it was a culture thing of having all these people together. It was the first time I saw all these brilliant journalists in one place within 1 year of an attempted coup of the leader of the new Russia, former Soviet Union. It was an astonishing thing on me personally. I know as freelance writers wanted to help each other, but they didn't know how to. The web had just been created, but no one was using it yet. And a guy in Sri Lanka says, I want information in Thailand, but I can't go to Thailand. So they were talking, how can we help each other? And I thought, because I have 2 political science degrees, and including international studies, and I thought, there's an opening. There's an opening here. Because, why? Because the commercial media hate each other. Every news organization wants to kill each other. So they'll never help each other. I mean, back then, they're doing it more now because of the big data stuff, but bear in mind that was in the last 3 or 4 years. So I thought, so a nonprofit can play a role as a convener, and I thought, my God, this is exciting. And then there was Chico Mendes. Probably no one here has ever heard of Chico Mendes, the rubber worker in Brazil who was brutally murdered, and everyone had to wait for the documentary film, which is going to take years. Sony high-8 cameras had been invented. Instead of those big, bulky $100,000 cameras, there were these little cameras. One guy, former NPR guy and TV guy, hired 24 former NPR people, gave them Sony high-8s, and had them all over the world to try to start doing video reporting on the web. An experiment. It didn't work. New York Times bought it for $10 million and did absolutely nothing with it, and it died. But people were thinking big thoughts. Around this, technology was changing, the web was coming, information was needed across the world, but how do you get it easily? You can't send a crew to Brazil, to the jungle, and get something back tomorrow. I mean, so how do you do this? And people were really, it was getting exciting. We even bought a Sony high-8 camera at the center. We couldn't afford it. But we had a tripod. Did we ever use it? No, it was a waste of money. But I was thinking, why am I telling you this? So I go to CNN. And I went to the vice president I knew. Were you there? You were there then. Yeah. I went to Pam Hill when she was vice president. I had known her at ABC. She loved this idea. And there was a grant from a foundation to CNN, from the Markle Foundation. And the CNN bigwigs wanted to use it for election coverage in 1992, not this. So I'm like, I'm trying everything, but it's not working, which entrepreneurs do. You got to try stuff. From 1992, why am I telling you this? Because this is what people who start things do. From 92 to through 97, I tried multiple ways to find money to make this idea work. Finally, in early '97, I sent a memo to the board, and I had been talking about it for years, but I said, I've just found some funding from foundations. We can now start the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. I hired a war zone reporter named Molly Beelman, who had been in the Balkans in Bosnia for 5 years. She'd seen people killed in front of her, and like amazing reporter, had done great work. And I brought her in, and then we got Nieman Fellows and Knight Fellows from Harvard and Stanford, preeminent journalists from around the world that had been identified by those two leading universities. Today, the International Consortium has 185, I call them Jedi Knights, premier journalists on planet Earth, and they are from 65 countries on 6 continents, all 6 inhabited continents. They have now done about 20 investigative projects across borders, and of course, especially here in Europe, you've seen in the last 3 years or so, 3 bank leak projects. Each of those projects had millions of bank records, and they were leaked to Jared Ryle, who runs ICIJ. He won 4 Walkleys, the equivalent of the Pulitzer in Australia, and he's originally from Ireland. So now he's reporting in his 3rd continent in Washington. The ICIJ is part of the Center for Public Integrity. It's in the offices, and the person who runs the center itself is in charge of everything, but the one who runs it day-to-day is the director of ICIJ. All the URLs are over here, but this is, I'm very excited about it. Why I'm excited? Because the last case of, I'm not going to go through this site, but if you go to projects or you just start looking around, they've been doing subjects now. Guess what? Now, every single time they get a multi-million data set, not money, unfortunately. They get money, but everyone wants it. Le Monde got 2 or 3 million bank records. Guess what? Le Monde. They just said, we don't know what to do with this. This is too big. It's too much. We're going to give it to the ICIJ. And why did they give it to the ICIJ? Because the ICIJ created a password-only access for the member organizations way for them to see the data, actual data for their country. They could find out who was hiding money offshore, former prime minister, current prime ministers. Laws changed from these 3 bank projects in over 12 countries. People hiding money offshore. But here's what's really exciting. I'll shut up about it. One more thing. This is huge, and this is historic. What I'm about, that's historic, but this is really historic. Now there are 40 news organizations, and I mean the leading ones in Europe. Folks like The Guardian, El País, Le Monde, several other people, Figaro, you name them, all over the world, not just Europe. And they want to be in on this now, and none of them are attempting to do it themselves. That is unbelievable. I mean, it takes your breath away. And so, what could happen from this? I don't know. I have lots of things I think it should do. I'm not on the board anymore. I'm just a pain in the ass founder, you know. I'm on the advisory board. But I talk to them all the time.
Shocking.
But yeah, I guess that is shocking. I mean, one thing I will just say, and I'll move on to other subjects, but I'm trying to get you thinking about possibilities, because guess what? This is a wild place, this world. Anything's possible, believe me. I've discovered this. You could actually, no one's done this, to my knowledge, you could actually create, and I can't believe no one's done it. There should be a webcast, which would be cheap, in other words, cheap production costs. There should be a webcast of the best investigative reporting on planet Earth that's available either every day or weekly. That, guess what? It doesn't exist now, to my knowledge. I've never seen it. But with groups like this, there's also an organized crime network of reporters in multiple countries, not restricted to Eastern Europe. Just kidding, but it is sort of where it's based, in the Balkans. So there's other networks now that are starting to be created. The Gates Foundation's been trying to create, and I actually pitched this to them 5 or 10 years ago, but I think they're actually trying to do something like it, to create a network of health reporters. And I had a wild and crazy idea. I was asked by the editor of the Columbia Journalism Review to predict the future of journalism few years ago, and in 2013 they published an article I wrote. And I noticed that young people, that would be you guys, at least in the US, most folks of a certain age are more interested in not what's on page 1 today, but the news that interests them, period. Search engine stuff. And guess what? News is not organized that way. And so I thought, what if? I noticed that all the awards for investigative reporting break down into themes. All the conferences I've been going to conferences as you have for a quarter century or longer. They break down into themes. So investigative reporters is a big, large number. I just went to a conference with 1,800 of them in IRE in Philadelphia, investigative reporting editors. Who's going to the global conference in October? Lillehammer. There will be 1,000 plus, right? 100 countries will be there. Rio had 1,400. So, but that doesn't tell us anything. That's a big number. What does it mean? There are investigative reporters tracking health, human rights, security, national security or international security, all kinds of issues. You name it. Climate change as a subset of environment. All these are subject areas. Guess what? Journalists have specializations. Cy Hirsch does national security. Other people do human rights. And so I think news could be organized that way. And I actually tried to, that was my vision of the future, my idea. I still think it has a possibility. I wanted to break down the organization of ICIJ, not by famous Jedi Knights, respected people in their countries. I wanted to do it also by interest areas. So you have the best health reporters, the best human rights reporters, the best security, secret, intelligence type reporters. I wanted to thematically organize them as well, because I think that's how audiences with social networks increasingly are doing it that way. So that was, because I'm supposed to theoretically predict the future in this modest talk. Just kidding. It wasn't my idea. That's your title. So that's one thing I think it's in its infancy. This only started in '97, and it's only really blossomed, especially blossomed in the last 3 years. And as I said, there's not a unifying element, and there's not also this segmentation type marketing that I just said of thematic subjects. Somebody is going to do these things. It's so obvious. I mean, it's unbelievably obvious. I would like a journalist to do it, not Bill Gates. Mm-hmm. I mean, he can fund it, but like I trust the journalist. Sorry, call me old-fashioned, which I am. Those are some things I wanted to mention. I also wanted to make a distinction. I won't spend a lot of time on it. But one thing that Paul showed you, the Global Investigative Journalism Network, GIJN, which we talked about. That is, I was a founding member of that in 2001 in Copenhagen. This started with 2 guys having a glass of wine, a great way to start something, just kidding. In 2001 in Denmark, Niels Malvad and Brant Houston, a U.S. former head, at the time, head of investigative reporters and editors. Niels Malvad started the DICAR, the basically Danish Institute for Computer System Reporting. They were having a glass of wine, and one of them said to the other, there should be a conference for journalists from all over the world, for investigative journalists. And so GIJN is Global Investigative Journalism Network, and it is a network of organizations, and yes, they include the Center for Public Integrity and ProPublica, and I'm going to come to my current organization in a minute, but yes, it involves those organizations, but it also involves IRE, and what's the difference? Does anyone know the difference between IRE and these other groups that I've mentioned earlier? I could just spit it out, I guess. IRE is a membership organization. It actually cannot do content. Data, yes, they release data sets to everyone from the government, but what I'm getting at, why can I not do it? Because it's comprised of member organizations, media organizations that help fund the conferences, and so there's a mutually assured destruction thing. If anyone takes advantage of IRE, it's no longer everyone's group. Well, GIJN is that. The one you heard earlier about today, and you saw the website. It's a great site. My organization, and I have 2 or 3 of them on it. The International Consortium is on it. The Center for Public Integrity is on it. One I'm going to talk about now, Investigative Reporting Workshop, is on it. but also groups, which brings me to another thing. I'm now tracking, I'm doing a survey of all the nonprofits in the world doing investigative journalism and producing original content. So am I including IRE? No. I'm trying to find the ones that, excuse my language, are investigating the bastards, whoever they are, naming names, producing, publishing content for which they're responsible. Yes, that could be death threats, that could be lawsuits, which we haven't talked about. I'll have to come back to that. So the GIJN is very useful, but it's a mixed bag, because some of those organizations are membership organizations. They're not just content organizations, it's both. It's kind of an amalgam of both worlds. It's extremely useful because I have a daily blog about what's happening in the world of international investigative reporting. Don't get me wrong, I respect it. I believe in it. I was there. I'm going to be at the next. I've been at all of them except one. The 9th is happening in Lillehammer. They are not doing original content like ICIJ. That's really the basic point I'm trying to make. Why is that relevant? Well, it's unlikely the Global Investigative Journalism Network is going to get sued because they're not producing original content. So the Center for Public Integrity has been sued. And when I ran it the first 15 years, we had 3 lawsuits. Not until my last 4 or 5 years, naturally. And we were sued by, we did a story about Dick Cheney, the then Vice President of the United States, and his prior activities as the head of Halliburton, which I'll talk about in a sec. And so we were sued by these two of the richest men in Russia, both billionaire oligarchs. And we were told that if we didn't take the story off our website within 24 hours, we were going to be sued by them and one of the biggest law firms in Washington, Aiken Gump. Here's the scrappy little center. Aiken Gump has 600 lawyers, and they're corporate lawyers representing just about anyone who will pay them, apparently. So, doesn't sound good, right? It sounds like, oh my God, look out, you know. That wave, it was that wave earlier. No, anyway, it went on for 5 years, 20 depositions. Has anyone in this room ever had a deposition? Yeah, it's really pleasant, right?
Very.
Yeah. Anyway, where you're questioned under the lights by lawyers for, in my case, 2 days, and it's video recorded. So anyway, and we were investigating Cheney's activities as CEO of the company, what they did in Siberia. They had a deal they were making, and it's a long story. I'll spare you the details. Unless you want to know, I can tell you every little thing you'd like to know, but I think it would be wrong to bother you with that. But anyway, after 5 long years, the biggest libel case in the United States in a quarter century, it was dismissed. It was dismissed by a Republican judge appointed by George W. Bush. So we weren't quite sure what was going to happen with that case. That's all I can say. It reaffirmed my belief in American democracy. But being sued is an occupational hazard for investigative reporting in particular. Truly it is. You're probably aware that 158 of 168 countries in the world have criminal libel laws. They don't just take all your money financially with a regular lawsuit. They put you in prison for the rest of your life or worse. Of course, more than 1,000 journalists murdered in the last decade or so. Most reporters who are killed are not in war zones. They're trying to track corruption. That's what investigative reporters, among others, do. And so this is a tricky business, this kind of journalism. But so the reason I mention it is about what's next, because some of the nonprofits do this work. And in some countries, the most important thing they could do is this kind of work. In some of the countries in Eastern Europe, the media is actually owned by organized crime elements. And the only way to, or in other parts of the Middle East, the only way you can do independent journalism is offshore with an independent platform online that people can't quite figure out who the hell owns it. It might be your only chance for anybody to see your information, because it sure as hell not going to be published in that country without there being repercussions. So, so anyway, this whole thing is an incredibly interesting landscape, needless to say. I run a group now. I I run a group. I didn't just run it, I started called the Investigative Reporting Workshop. Yeah, how did that happen?
Amazing.
Wow,
Magic.
that's impressive, seriously. I wasn't going to do it, I was trying to be quick and modest. But anyway, today of the 100 nonprofits in the U.S., 18 are at universities. This is the only one in Washington, D.C., and it's the largest of the 18. We're not that large. The Center for Public Integrity's annual budget is close to $10 million. Our annual budget's about $1.5 million. And 500,000 of that comes from Frontline. Has anyone ever heard of Frontline in the U.S.? The documentary production outfit. This is a documentary we did with Frontline, our 8th co-production with them since when? I guess 2008. We've done 8 now, which is a lot. We have a world-class producer who's won numerous Emmys in our offices, and an editing suite for Frontline in our offices, which no one else at the School of Communication at American University, where I'm based. This is at American University. I'm a professor there, and I run this thing. If you looked at the staff, which we don't need to do, but I've been very fortunate. I've assembled an all-star team. I've got the former deputy managing editor of USA Today for graphics and photos, Lynn Perry. I've got the former dean, Larry Kirkman, but I also had down here John Sullivan. John Sullivan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who I jointly hired with the Washington Post. The Washington Post called me and they said he had just won the Pulitzer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And they said, "We hear you're trying to hire John Sullivan." And I said, "I hear you're trying to hire John Sullivan." And I said, "Are you going to do it? Do you have enough money?" And the guy goes, "No, we don't." And he said, "How about if we make a deal?" So we did a memorandum of understanding and we jointly hired this guy. It's amazing. So John is a senior editor to me. He is an investigative journalist in residence at American University. In the last 2 years, he has taught students, hold on to your seat, inside the Washington Post newsroom. 40 students have had bylines in the Washington Post, contributed research or bylines, some on page 1 of the Washington Post. He is now in the investigative team of the Washington Post, member of the faculty and on our staff. It's a very unusual model. David Donald has won the highest data journalism award in the U.S. and some say the world, the Phil Meyer Award. He just did a project a year ago with 700 million records, at the time the biggest data journalism project ever done in the world. David works for me. He's a data editor. He is a data journalist in residence as a member of the faculty. I said if we were going to have an investigative reporting track, then we should make sure we have data journalism as a key component in this 21st century world. It's essential, and so we, in my view, got the best person. So anyway, we're stirring up trouble. We've also hired dozens of freelance writers, Bartlett and Steele, probably the 2 most respected economics reporters since the last 40 years in America, helping them do their book. I'll spare you. But anyway, that's the idea. So it's a peculiar animal being we are inside the belly of the beast. We are actually within the university. I did it because I'd already started 3 or 4 independent, standalone 501c3 organizations. I wanted to see what would it be like to be inside. I knew if I was inside a university, I would have better access to the high-def video studios with the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment that I couldn't afford. I knew I would have access to hundreds and hundreds of databases from all over the planet Earth that I would never be able to afford. I knew that I would have free rent. And I knew that I would be doing institutionalized mentoring. I had already had 250 paid interns when I ran the center. They were all paid. But I also knew I didn't see them as much. I got to meet each one and talk to them, but then they were gone. So this is a really unusual model because it is I hate to use the words, but it is a teaching hospital approach. We're trying to develop tomorrow's great journalists. The last 4 of our, the Washington Post has a paid fellowship master's degree. The last 4 of them have been hired directly by the Washington Post as full-time reporters. Not too shabby. And yes, did that mean people want to come to the school? Yes, these things are related. And so anyway, this project we just did with National Public Radio, WAMU. We had 8 students go through 2,000 police search warrants in the District of Columbia. So that was done with the leading public radio station in Washington, and one of the leading ones in America, and us. And then with Center for Investigative Reporting has this syndicated radio thing now called Reveal, as you well know. And so it was broadcast nationwide in addition to being in DC. We do a lot of partnerships. This was another front line. This was Washington Post, page 1. We partnered with the New Yorker magazine. We did a project about the Koch Brothers. Has anyone heard of the Koch Brothers in America? The second richest brothers, the richest brothers in the world, that happens to be the second richest donors to political campaigns. I think it's the richest ever in American history. They are hoping to spend $900 million with their other billionaire friends. $900 million on the 2016 election. That is equal to the amount spent by either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So now we have billionaire donors spending as much with their pals as a political party in America. Welcome to the United States. And so we wanted to look at how they were. You may have heard that in the United States, climate change legislation was killed. In 2011, Obama tried to pass a law. It didn't work. We dissected why it didn't work. It's because these guys funded 89 nonprofit groups that had happy-sounding names like the Center for Blue Skies. I'm making that up, but happy names. And they would all go up and testify under oath, so help me God, about how climate change is really not an issue. There'd be a PhD chemist working for some happy-sounding group that was funded by the Kochs. We posted 500 IRS tax documents for the 89 nonprofits that they, 5 years of thousands of pages up on the cloud that people could access. Jane Mayer of the New Yorker did the story that showed they did a pledge with members of Congress, and climate change legislation from Obama was dead on arrival. It had no chance whatsoever. They had given money to every one of the freshmen, the new first-term members of Congress, and all together had spent $134 million. Their company lobbying, their campaign contributions directly by the company and them, and then seeding these nonprofits, which is theoretically a violation of tax law, but of course the IRS doesn't enforce the tax laws because it reports to Congress, which is funded by these people. So anyway, that was called the Koch Club, and the New Yorker jointly published with us. We did a project on immigration detention, solitary confinement. You may or may not know that the worst solitary confinement on planet Earth is actually in the U.S. And it's also true that any given day in America, 300 people are immigration detention folks. 300 of those folks are in solitary. We did a project on page 1 of the New York Times. We had the data. The New York Times wanted the data. We said, you can have the data, but we're going to jointly publish with us. And they didn't want to do it. And we said, okay, see you. And they said, whoa, 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 whoa. And so they gave us a joint byline and mentioned the workshop. I mean, my filmmaker in residence who had the data. And so that's cool. But anyway, and there was an investigation within 72 hours. So what we're doing is having fun in a different way. It's not the center. It's a scrappy, unusual thing. Many, many partnerships, many more than the center does. And we do it at the outset. We just figure out we're going to have more eyeballs if we do this. They don't have the people to do this stuff. We need eyeballs. We want credibility. It would also help the students. Everybody wins. Thank you, God. Kumbaya. And it works. I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm less interested. I mean, I've neglected things. A lot of the great things that you've seen about building an organization. I'm less interested in making the Investigative Reporting Workshop famous or a brand name. I'm mostly interested in the substance of the work itself. But anyway, but to the nonprofit context, I've raised about 40 million US dollars in the last, I don't know, 25, 26 years. So I have dealt a lot, and when we do questions, you may want to talk about that stuff. Yes, I know how to do that. And by the way, international foundations support the consortium in particular. They are nuts over the consortium. They would like it to not be based in the U.S., among other things. I wrote a book last year with a rather inflammatory title, 935 Lies, The Future of Truth and the Decline of America's Moral Integrity, you know, a passive type book. Anyway, but at the last chapter is called The Future of Truth, and I have a wild and crazy idea. I seem to have them occasionally. This one is the wildest, perhaps, and the idea is I've noticed that some of the most impressive information I've run across lately. Wow, you're way over there.
I'm trying to.
Yeah. What are they looking at up there now? Nothing gets by me. But yeah, click it.
And then click the.
They click on the book.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. That's nice.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. We're doing a project with a public anthropologist at American University, and he has tracked. Is it Christmas? What?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I guess it's NPR.
Oh, no, it's not Christmas, it's NPR. That's good. Anyway, we're working with a public anthropologist who has tracked every U.S. military base and installation on planet Earth. No journalist has done that. And we're going to look at one continent in particular that has not been examined closely. We're going to do maps, we're going to do graphics, we're going to do all kinds of cool stuff. The article is going to be by the public anthropologist who has a PhD. We're doing another project with multiple data sets, probably 3 to 5 data sets involving climate change, and I'm not going to go deeper on it because every one of you will run out and do this one. This is such an obvious one. I can't wait though. Regarding the subject of water. And, but I have an MIT, Harvard connected computer scientist, and we found public data sets that no one has ever used. And that'll be potentially involving that person as well directly. So what I'm trying to do is I'm noticing in the old days would be last week, no, I'm just kidding. The old days would, feels like that some days. The old days would be like the last century, as my son would put it. You know, a reporter, even recently to this year even, a reporter would talk to a professor who devoted the last 5 years of his life. The book I did took 9 years. 3 manuscripts, 2 publishers, a partridge in a pear tree. It was quite an ordeal. But most reporters will go interview a professor that has immersed in some subject, write the whole thing. It sounds like a great thing. My God, this is so interesting. And then they'll have a 1-sentence quote from the professor who did all the work for the last 5 years. Well, it's pretty obvious that increasingly the best data and the best document gathering and the best analysis has been done often, not always, but many times by academics. So I also have a lot of students who want to do good things in this world, but they're not sure where they're going to work. I know that never occurred to anyone here. And you know, not only want to do good things in the world, but would like to do things involving information and data, but they're not sure where that will lead. So I decided, well, it's not up to me, but I think there should be a new field called accountability studies. So you take a little forensic accounting, a little bit of statistics, a little bit of political science tracking corruption in the world, a little bit of human rights law about how do you go after the bastards. All of these things, you start to get a smattering of information that's about accountability. We have dysfunction in virtually every part of the world, in every government, both at the nation-state level and at the international level, in my view. I think it's rather obvious. So, so I'm actually going to be at Oxford for a couple months, up the road, across the pond, another pond, a little pond. Anyway, looking at accountability studies, they want me to do a short book. I said, only if my workshop co-publishes. And, but I'm going to look at this as a phenomenon, and my understanding from them is Europe's ahead of the U.S. in this subject area. I don't know if that's true. But I think there is some evidence that this is necessary now. Journalism is moving way too fast. Most journalists don't have time now. We do have 1/3 reporters, as we did in 2000 in America, professional reporters. The number of public relations people is 4 to 5 times what it was in 1960. It used to be 1-to-1 ratio. Now it's 4-to-1 or 5-to-1. The most people working in the White House right now for handling media used to be, well, it's Obama, the highest number. Last time before that was George W. Bush. The last time before that was Clinton. And so everyone has more people handling the media. Studies show that news content in the US, UK, and Australia, 50% or more of it is actually press releases. And so I want to find ways to put more accountability information into reporting. I think we need more. We can't rely on press releases. We can't rely on parroting back what some spokesperson said. Has anyone heard of this thing called The Conversation? This is the first attempt in the world that I'm aware of. And it's an experiment. There's no other way to call it that, anything else. It started in Australia. Now it has also come to Europe, and it's come to the US, and it's now moving into India and Africa. And that is, there are thousands of professors who are, many of whom had blogs and websites, and they write books, but they also write short stuff, including op-eds, but the op-ed hole was getting smaller and smaller in commercial newspapers. So they are all signed up, close to 10,000 of them around the world, and they're doing essay type, sort of essays about issues, but they're all very substantive with links and everything, and they're relatively short, 1,200 words, which is about the op-ed length, but they're substantive with links. And now they're being cross-meshed across 5 continents. That's never been done before. What's even more intriguing is the funding is, yes, from foundations, but it's also from either some governments, but also from universities are actually funding it directly. I don't know where that's going, but it's another model. We haven't talked about it. But to me, it's not a wise thing to, if you have someone who's been sitting on data for 5 years and it's great, why in the world would you not use it? And what's so terrible about, if they have written an analytical thing and it's not a screed, not a partisan or ideological screed, but it's actually fact-based, what a concept, then why wouldn't you think to do that? I mean, in my view, that's perfectly reasonable. And so I'm exploring that as an idea. So I was supposed to say, what's next? Did I go over? I forget what time.
It's okay. We have time for questions, but you can finish up.
Well, there's 1 or 2 things.
Yep.
I promise. There's too much going on here. I think there'll be more partnerships. You may have noticed I'm into partnerships. I think you're going to see more and more of it. It makes sense. Why would you reinvent the wheel if you think these folks can help you and they've got it? Why in the world would you do that yourself in this day and age? It's crazy. So you're going to see more of them. I think you're going to, well, the other thing I'll mention is we don't know the fate of the for-profit experiments, not entirely. They haven't had enough time to fail or succeed. I'm talking about BuzzFeed, Mashable, and Vice, those kinds of places. Now, those are the for-profit models of right now, some of them. They have a massive audience. It takes my breath away how much audience they have. And yes, it's millennials and mostly young audiences. The question is, how much substantive investigative reporting will they be doing, and how much will be breathless other types of journalism? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm hoping it's heavily substantive, but here's the sad, sorry truth about investigative reporting, which is my particular interest, not just nonprofit journalism. Investigative reporting has rarely ever carried anything financially by itself. 60 Minutes, 110 stories a year, most successful news program in the U.S. and probably arguably the world, one of them at least. 110 original segments. 10, I would say 5 are probably investigative. And original investigative, meaning the staff generated the original investigation. It's not a book report. It's not something somebody brought them. It's not a rip-off of a newspaper reporter's thing with interviewing a few people. Original investigative reporting, probably 1 or 2 out of 110, and that's being generous to 60 Minutes. That's the premier show in America, so think about that. So this is kind of scary. So why am I saying this? Because investigative reporting has never paid for itself in 100 years by itself. McClure's magazine, Lincoln Steffens, all the famous muckrakers of the late 19th century into the 20th century. We celebrate all of them, Ida Tarbell, Nellie Bly, Lincoln Steffens, all these wonderful people. They are wonderful. I have all their books. I worship them, yes. Guess what? It was like Vanity Fair of that period. Vanity Fair is mostly celebrity junk. Lots of nice pictures. And then there'll be one insightful article, maybe, if you're lucky. And New Yorker, same model. I mean, all of these are somewhat similar. So this kind of journalism is always going to have an issue about the substance factor being too substantive and scaring away viewers, readers, clickers, you know, whatever. The part that I think I'm most, I'll do the negative thing real quick that worries me, and then I'll mention the one that intrigues me, and to end with that. The one that worries me, and I'll be very blunt, is what's happening with artificial intelligence. There are conferences, and you may have been to some of them, where the Google data folks are mixed in with the computer-assisted reporting folks. One group is of the generation who did reporting using computers in the 70s, 80s, 90s. The other folks just started shaving last week. No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, they're a newer generation. They don't know anything about journalism, but they're really good with their computer. And so you get this cultural mesh of things that's starting to occur. And what the folks who run the artificial intelligence companies have said openly in these gatherings is that they believe that 90% of all journalism in the U.S. will be done by, yes, machines, computers, not humans, in the next 10 years. They said it not smiling. They said it flatly, officially, as a fact to the group, which you can imagine they were almost killed. No, I'm just kidding. They weren't. People are very polite. And they also said that they would win a Pulitzer Prize also with artificial intelligence in the next 10 or 15 years. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I do know, we all know it's being used now. I saw what happened to the bank tellers. 150,000 of them lost their jobs. And I do think there are going to be people eventually, I think that is a significant concern. I don't think it's unreasonable. It goes way past journalism. I think it involves social and economic policy of countries. I mean, does our Department of Labor in the U.S. have any idea what's going to happen with this or what to do about it? No. Does anyone here, since this is Germany, ever read Global Trap? This was written by 2 Der Spiegel journalists and published in 2000, a global bestseller. 250,000 people bought the book all over the world. And they were at a meeting at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco in 1995 where they admitted 20 to 30 million people would lose their jobs because of automation-related issues in the 20th century. And they didn't know what was going to be the problem, but they didn't have to worry about it, ha ha ha, because they were all going to retire. That's the opening chapter of the book. They have not done a sequel to their book, but all I'm saying is be aware of this. I think it's a relevant thing. Now, investigative reporting is, in my field, is the most difficult type of thing to just automate for obvious reasons. You get sued, you've got sensitive information. Yes, it involves humans. You have to meet with them personally. But I also think this is something for the profession. We can't talk about the future, what's next, and not acknowledge that reality. Last thing. This is going to sound odd, but everything I've said probably sounds odd. I actually think there's a really interesting model. We always say, what's the most successful nonprofit that involves information? What's the most successful one? What's the biggest one? What is that? And no one wants to say it because we don't know what to think of it. But Wikipedia has a $50 million annual budget from a lot of individuals all over planet Earth and foundations. I'm not saying it's perfect and they don't do investigative reporting, and I'm not suggesting they are. On the other hand, there's an interesting model there. Is that have any possibilities involving investigative reporting? Attempts at crowdfunding for investigative reporting have not gone well. I think it's fair to say. I could go into detail, but time's short. They probably shouldn't go well, because then you have like the posse taking over I mean, you have a crowdsourcing, crowdfunding thing out of control where you're getting people, and it's not really objective journalism. But on the other hand, citizens believing they should have better information and supporting it. That is the public media model for radio and television throughout Europe and the US. So what's so wildly different? There's 170 million people in America that support NPR and PBS and other public media. How many would support investigative reporting online? I think many of them do now, but not those kinds of numbers. But I think that the economic model has not really remotely been tested. And could there be an investigative, high quality, really spectacularly high quality version of Wikipedia that you would have to call it something else? But then no one would come because they would think it was like Wikipedia to get all this traffic. Anyway, but you can see, I just think a lot of cool things are going to happen. What has happened up till now is nothing but a prelude. And that's what's really exciting. So I'll stop there. Thank you.